So I was asked recently, what is one of the most exciting adventures I've ever been on? Well, I want to share a story about an adventure that wasn't so much exciting, but it was more life-changing. About 10 years ago, I went with a photographer friend of mine from a particular part of China, and we smuggled ourselves into northern Burma. And for anyone who understands Burma, the geography around the borders of Burma is where the indigenous land is and where the many ethnic groups live. Including the Rohingya, the Shan, the Karen, and we spent time with the Kachin. And for those that understand the complexity, there is a mishmash of different religions associated with each ethnic group. Some are Christian, some are Buddhist, and some are Muslim. So the Kachin people, this was 2 months after the Burmese military junta had signed the peace treaty with the ethnic groups, and there had been a big announcement by the US at the time, and they'd signed the peace treaty in the January, and then shortly after that, within a matter of days, they had broken the peace treaty and bombed the capital city of Kachin, which is called Liza. And so we went in 2 months after that bombing. People had died during the bombing, of course. So when I was there, I spent time in a refugee camp, and it was a really amazing experience because there were so many kids and there were no adults. And so I said to one of the organizers of the refugee camp, like, where are all the adults? Because there were hundreds of kids running around. And she said, well, actually, these kids were walked through the jungle over a couple of months to get here because the military were raising their villages. So they don't know if their parents are dead or alive. And if you can imagine, like a kindergarten, it's lots of noise, kids running around playing. This was kind of the feeling of what it was like. And then a bell rang, and it was getting close to dinner time. So the kids came running up and they grabbed their plates, and they all formed a very orderly line, but they were still like, jostling about and nudging each other and talking. And then within a certain kind of like sound or bell rang again, everybody just went silent. Absolutely silent. You could hear a pin drop. And then the children broke out into song, and they were singing a prayer for their families. They didn't know whether they were dead or alive. And some of these kids were as young as 2. So that rocked me, that experience. And then after that, I traveled 8 hours through the jungle as the only woman with the military, who came to pick us up with their AK-47s, and we went 8 hours through the jungle to Liza. And when I arrived there, I spent time with the military. I saw all the buildings that had been bombed out. I spent time hearing their stories, really. And it just so happened, when you talk of these synergistic moments or these synchronicities, that while I was there had been a peace march from Yangon all the way up to Liza, which also took a couple of months. And it was a former Burmese soldier who had taken 5 years to quit the military. He didn't want to participate in the killings and the rape and the torture and the razing of villages and all these types of things. So he had fled to Singapore. Then when he saw the student uprisings in Yangon, he thought, okay, change is coming, so now I'm going to go home. And of course, when he came back, the military confiscated his passport, and he's basically held prisoner in his own country. He's not in a prison per se, but he's being monitored, and he can't leave. And then he, plus some leaders of other ethnic groups, came together to take on this peace march. And along the way, they confronted a number of cronies or people that had been hired to serve the military and were oppressing certain communities. And these guys on the peace march, they would take books to the kids, or they would go in and take food and then have to confront the cronies who were, starving these people out and whatnot. And they got to Liza, and I happened to be there, and they came and they had guitars and they were singing songs, and they had their little Sony Handycam where they had filmed a lot of their journey. And I was privileged to watch a lot of their stories and see for myself, what they had endured during this time. Now, independent to this, I'd done my research and I looked at like, what's the geopolitical situation here? Like, what is it about these ethnic groups along the borders that is having the junta destroy this? So, and it just, you know, the military junta were incentivized for the peace treaties with a financial contribution from a multi-donor trust fund. So I'm fairly certain that once that money was banked, I saw the video footage where they didn't retreat at all. They actually just repositioned. That gave them a few days to get a better position on the capital city, and that was when they bombed it. So what I learned about the politics is that up the east and west coast of the country are these natural gas pipelines. And the pipelines are very, very rich. The Irrawaddy is, you know, one of the most biodiverse rivers in the world, and the land is very fertile, and there's these gas pipelines. So essentially what had happened is that a number of oil and gas companies had contracted these pipelines, and then through agencies and whatever, the agencies were working with the government, the Burmese government, to meet the requirements of the contract. And that of course meant displacing people. Now under the Burmese constitution, and I had the constitution translated for me, the government owns all land, all air up into the heavens essentially, and can take it back from the people at any time without compensation. And that is what had actually happened in Yangon when they had done the cleaning up and opening up to the west. There had been generations of people living along the river's edges and in the towns in slums, and they basically got displaced without compensation and moved on and were made homeless as a result. And so what I realized though about these oil and gas companies is that I don't know whether they're aware of the ethnic cleansing that's going on in the country. I'm sure they are, because the press has reported on it. But even if they aren't, it's their money that's paying the agents that's then working with the government to clear those people out. And because of the deep-seated hatred and racism of the Burmese towards ethnic groups, for them that justifies removing people from their land, razing their villages, raping the women, torturing people for information, murder, which is what's happening in the country, and still to this day. It's not something that has just stopped. And we saw a couple of years ago a big documentary coverage on, you know, the horrible treatment of the Rohingya people and the mass displacement that was happening into Bangladesh. But these oil and gas companies, they're rating pretty high on the ESG indices. And when I was seeing this, I knew that there was really a problem in the way in which we're conceptualizing sustainability and ESG. Because to me, this is a supply chain issue. This is an issue that companies need to be held accountable for the mass genocide of peoples and destruction of environment and the displacement of human beings and wildlife that is not currently being accounted for. And so it was after this trip that I realized that some of the very well-meaning and well-intentioned systems that we had created to better serve people and to serve the planet, they just weren't getting us there. And that was where I really needed to dig deep within myself to say, how can we actually step outside the paradigm of thinking that's had us create these types of messes and start to imagine a way of being, a way of relating to the world that's completely different. And that was when I really dug very deeply into regeneration.